Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I talk with Greg Alexander about how executive leadership can effectively and sustainably scale their firm, as well as how to choose the right time to exit the organization. Greg Alexander, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation with you today. I really appreciate you joining me. And we're going to be exploring something that's a little bit different than our typical topics. With your expertise, and I'll share your bio in just a moment, but with your expertise, we're going to be speaking about sustainably scaling businesses and then executives choosing the right time to leave the firm when that's appropriate, the exit strategy, how to go about doing that effectively. As we get started, I wanted, as we get started, I wanted to share Greg's bio with everybody. Greg Alexander is founder of Collective 54. He contributes to entrepreneurs by helping them scale and exit their firms. Greg co-founded SBI, a professional service firm, and served as CEO. Prior to SBI, Greg was an executive at EMC Corporation, a leader in the data storage industry. Really great background. Again, I'm super excited to have this conversation with you today. Before we dive on in, anything you would like to share with listeners by way of your personal background or context?
The only thing I would add to that is, I think of my career in 3 chapters, and this might be helpful to those that are listening to this to see who I am and what I talk about. So chapter 1 was that of an employee. That's when I was at EMC, now Dell. I was there for 10 years. Chapter 2 was that as an entrepreneur, and that's when I had Sales Benchmark Index, which I sold in 2017, otherwise known as SBI. And that was the largest exit of its kind in the consulting business, so I'm proud of that. And the chapter I'm in right now is that as investor, private investor. And one of the companies I invested in is called Collective 54, and that's a membership organizations for founders and co-founders of boutique professional services firms. So I mentioned those 3 things just to let the audience know it's kind of cradle to grave. In 3 individual chapters. So I'm in the 3rd chapter right now and plan on doing that for the rest of my career.
Yeah, that's, that's really great. And maybe you can tell us just a little bit more about your current firm, the approach that you take, because I think it's a service that's very vitally needed.
Yeah, so Collective 54 is a membership organization for founders of professional services firms. So what is a professional services firm? Well, according to the federal government, the industry code is 54. So that's why the name is Collective 54. So think of IT service firms, marketing agencies, consulting firms, design shops, lawyers, accountants, etc. And what they share in common is that they're a people business and they're selling and delivering their expertise in some version of the billable hour model. And that type of business has a very specific set of challenges when you're trying to scale it and someday when you're trying to sell it. So members of Collective 54 join, and it's like a mastermind group on steroids, if you're familiar with that. And they work with their peers, because it's all peer-to-peer based, to try to overcome obstacles to scale and exit by sharing best practices with each other.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And like I said, it's very much needed, and I'm sure you agree since you started the firm. It certainly can have a huge impact when you just get people together to talk about and support each other as they're going through the challenging issues that organizations face, and leaders and entrepreneurs, with a good idea, they get, they start their business. They don't always have the background, the expertise in all the ins and outs of the day-to-day running of businesses. And certainly once you start talking about scaling, that's a whole different beast from the initial launch stage. And so having that support network, I think is incredibly important. So that's wonderful. Let's talk a little bit now about entrance and then moving to scaling. So many entrepreneurs, they're going to start and their business is going to stay small. They have no ambitions of you know turning their firm into a large organization. But others absolutely have that as a goal, whether it's through investors or just the organic growth or whatever the case may be. How do you approach the scaling question? How to scale, when to start scaling, how to do it sustainably. How do you approach that with people in your organization?
Yeah, great question. So what we have found within the professional services sector, which again, that's our area of focus. So we'll use that as our test case or our use case here. There's a natural life cycle, and the life cycle looks like this. So some smart people start a firm, and for the first 5 years or so, they're in what we call the growth stage. And what they're focused on there is acquiring their first set of clients, hiring their first group of employees, and just validating their business model. And the benefit of that stage is that they no longer work for the man, so to speak. They have the freedom and the intellectual stimulation that comes with being an entrepreneur. But what they're mainly focused on is funding their lifestyle and just being able to not have to work for a corporation but work for themselves. And then what happens at some point along the way is a group of those, not everybody, but a group of those say, you know what, my aspirations have expanded beyond just having a great lifestyle, and I want to scale my firm. So what does that mean? Well, that means the 70-hour work week is no longer sustainable. So to scale, it's not about working more, it's about working differently, about doing things differently than you did in the growth stage. For example, you have to replicate yourself. If all roads go through you and you're required to be in every client meeting or every employee meeting, then the firm won't scale. You become the bottleneck. So there's a series of things you need to do to remove yourself as a bottleneck to scale the organization beyond, the brilliance of the founding team. That lasts for about another 5 years. So let's say the growth stage is kind of year 0 to 5. The scale stage is, call it years 6 to 10. And then there's the exit stage, which is 11 plus years. And within Collective 54, we have several members in this category. And what ends up happening there is human beings are curious individuals. And after you've been doing something for 15 years, you have other interests and you want to move on and do something else. Maybe you want to start your next firm. Maybe you want to retire. I don't know, but you want to do something else. So now you got to figure out a way to sell your firm. And selling a services business is a challenge because there's no assets. The assets are people, your people and your clients. It's not like you've got a manufacturing facility or, inventory or anything along those lines. So how you actually sell a business is a different set of obstacles. And what happens to your firm after it's sold? What happens to your loyal employees? What happens to your long-standing client relationships? These all become the area of focus for entrepreneurs at that time. So there's a life cycle there that I would encourage your listeners to consider.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And again, you may start off as an entrepreneur with one set of goals in mind. And I think that the natural life cycle of an organization is important to remember, but also just the ebbs and flows of individual interest, life stage that can influence your goals and your ambitions. So you may start off thinking that you want to focus on, just a small scale professional service firm, you and a small team, and that's something you're going to be satisfied with for the rest of your career. But you get a few years into it, and very well you may change your mind. You may decide that you want to scale, or you may decide that you want to exit and move on to something else. And so ultimately, I think it's just very important for us to recognize the ebbs and flows of the nascent organization that is growing over and maturing over time, the ebbs and flows of life stage, life cycle, and how people's attitudes, people's desires, wants, needs, ambitions also shift over time. You also talked briefly about the sustainable scaling approach, and like you said, if everything runs through me, I'm the boss, and I have to be at every meeting, I'm going to be the bottleneck. That simply isn't scalable, and it's not sustainable. I might think that I can just do more, or that I can just be more efficient, and I might be able to do that to a certain extent. But over time, you just have to replicate yourself. You have to find other good people to join your team so that you can scale sustainably. do you have any examples or experiences with firms that scaled in unsustainable ways, and perhaps how that hurt them in the long run?
I think the best example is, let me speak from firsthand experience. So in 2006, I founded a company called SBI, which was an acronym for Sales Benchmark Index. We were in the business to business sales consulting space. And our clients hired us to help them improve the effectiveness of their sales force. And we served big companies like Hewlett Packard and Phillips 66, et cetera. And when I started the business, I was right out of central casting, the way that you described it. So I was a sales leader at a large company called EMC. I quit to start my own business because I wanted to go into business myself. And in the early days, I brought in every client, I delivered every project, and that's the way it was. And then as volume increased, I hired what I called Greg bots. So these were people like me, they were junior people, but I told them what to do. I created procedural manuals and basically said color by numbers. And that worked for a period of time. But again, one day I woke up and I said, geez, I'm getting a lot of personal validation from this. It feels good that clients need me. It feels good that employees need me. But, is this really what I want out of my life? And I think back to life stage, I started my firm in my 30s, and then this stage I'm referring to right now, the scale stage, I'm in my 40s. Things have changed. And I started saying to myself, what do I want to be doing the next 5, 10, 15 years? Like, what's the end game here? So then I started hiring in people that were no longer Greg bots. In fact, they were better than Greg. And I no longer went on sales calls. So I built a commercial sales team. They could go out and sell work better than I could. And I empowered those people. We hired experienced delivery people. So people that could run projects on time, on spec, on budget, way better than I could. And we built up whole departments. We hired a back office team that handled finance and IT and HR and legal. When you're a 5-person shop, you don't need HR. When you're a 100-person shop, you do. People want to know what their career path is. It needs to be formal training programs and competencies and all this stuff. So that's what ended up happening, for me over time. Now, and it came down to, what did I want? It would have been easy for me to be one of many and just, be a solopreneur and hang my shingle and live my life. But, that wasn't what my aspirations were. But Jonathan, you brought up a really good point. When I started my firm, those were my aspirations.
I'm excited to announce the publication of my new book from HCI Press, The Alchemy of Truly Remarkable Leadership: Ordinary, Everyday Actions That Produce Extraordinary Results. Consider how the nature of work has shifted over the past 50 years. With increased globalization, rapid technological advancement, and the shift in economic composition, the average job of today looks very different than the average job of 50 years ago. What will the jobs and organizations of tomorrow look like? Moreover, what does this all mean for organizational leaders? What are the core competencies and capabilities of organizations and their leadership that are prepared for continued disruption and geopolitical and socioeconomic shifts? Regardless of what the future holds, increasingly, leaders need to be socially minded, data-driven, decisive, champions of talent, and disruptors of the traditional notions of leadership, teams, organizations, and work. The Alchemy of Truly Remarkable Leadership will help you to explore your own leadership competencies and capabilities and consider ways to apply and implement them into your workplace and personal life.
And then, I'm 3, 4, 5 years into my firm, and my aspirations expanded, my ambition expanded because I saw the market opportunity. And I think it's great counsel that you're giving your readers is to let that happen. Don't assume that the original plan is the only plan. The original plan is going to change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's completely natural, completely normal. And, so sometimes I talk with executives who struggle with that. They struggle with those transition periods, and understandably, people like stability, people like a sense of certainty, even if it's, faux certainty. I'm not sure there's any real certainty out there, but people like to at least feel like there's some sort of stability in their life. And when you're going through these transitional stages, there can be a bit of an existential crisis that you go through. There's a reason why we talk about midlife crisis. Now, it doesn't have to be midlife. You don't have to have a midlife crisis in your 40s. It can happen in your 20s, 30s, 40s, whenever. It's really, the midlife crisis is all about these transitional periods in your life as you're seeing what you thought you wanted, what you thought you need, and all of a sudden you realize that served you for a time, it doesn't really serve you anymore. So now you have to reinvent yourself. You have to figure out what really drives you now and what's going to drive you into the future. And we all go through ebbs and flows of that. We all, shift over time, and we don't need to be scared of that. So, starting off as a solopreneur, awesome. And if that satisfies you and you want to continue that way, great. But it's also completely normal that over time, your feelings might change about those sorts of things. And so you get into the role of growth and scaling at some point. Obviously there's just so many challenges with that, and you just described building out the back office staff and the departments. Absolutely. I know so many organizations, if we talk now just from an organizational leadership HR standpoint, so many organizations that they start small. And like you said, if you have a team of 5, 10 people, you really don't need an HR person. You need someone with some at least basic level of HR knowledge, so you're not majorly stepping in it and causing problems or compliance issues or whatever with labor and employment law. But you don't really need HR. But when you get up to like 50, 100 plus people, you do. And I see a lot of times organizations that have scaled rapidly, that all of a sudden they're at that level and they still have nobody. They still have no back end staff for that kind of support. And that's where it gets really scary, because they end up inevitably causing lots of problems. And it not necessarily because they have bad intentions, because they're trying to exploit their people, they're trying to break the laws or anything like that. It's just they don't know what they don't know. They don't have that expertise. The founders and the founding executive team, they don't have all that skill set. They certainly don't have the bandwidth to do everything themselves. And so you do have to, over time, be able to build out your team and just make sure that you have the right competencies and capabilities as you grow, your organization matures, and it gets more complex, right?
And what I see in that scenario for firms that make that mistake, they don't invest properly in the human resources function as they suffer from high employee turnover. And in a services business where your people are your product, high employee turnover is incredibly damaging. It takes a while to recruit, select, hire, onboard, and make productive an expert. And if that person comes into your firm and 2 or 3 years in, they quit because they don't see a career path for them, which is something the HR group would provide to them, they're going to leave. I mean, experts, professional services people in particular, they choose where to work. They're highly employable people. They're in great demand. And if they're working for your firm, you have to have an employee value proposition. An employee value proposition is, why should you work for my firm versus somebody else? I ask founders all the time, would you work for you? And if the answer to that question is, I don't know, you got a problem. And the takeaway here is to build a succession plan. So if you have a business strategy that says, I'm going to go from X to Y over the next 10 years, that has to be married up with a people plan and a succession plan that says, I'm going to need, X amount of analysts, X amount of engagement managers, X amount of directors, VPs, partners, et cetera. And think of it as a supply chain, so to speak, where you're bringing people in at certain levels and moving them up over the organization over time. And that's oftentimes, not done, or if it's done tactically and in a reaction mode. It's in response to some crisis. All of a sudden, key employees start quitting, and you're like, oh crap, I got to do something about this. My advice to the listener would be, don't let that happen. I mean, be proactive about it and design it as part of the fundamental business strategy, the HR strategy.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's one example that I can think of. This was a family. It's still a family-run business, but it's a family-run business that has been around for 100 years and is quite large today. But it's still, they managed, pretty much the entire executive team is all, members of the original founding family. About 1,000 employees, and they hired their first HR person probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And so when you have 1,000+ employees and you have no HR person, there's inevitably going to be problems. And they finally, after decades and decades of successful, you know, running and scaling their business, they finally started to realize that there was a lot of stuff they didn't know how to do. And they were, I don't know if there was a lawsuit or something like that that woke them up to it, but they all of a sudden they realized this is something they needed to pay attention to. So they brought someone in the very first time they'd ever had a one full-time HR person for 1,000+ employee firm, that is still crazy, right? But at least now they have somebody. That person came in and had to spend the first 2 years just cleaning up messes, right? Making sure they were compliant with employment and labor law, just putting in place necessary policies, practices, procedures for the organization when it comes to the people side of things. First couple of years, just simply damage control, right? Just trying to clean things up before they could even start, focusing on other important work that needed to happen. And, it's a cautionary tale. I think they were lucky that they lasted as long as they did without having someone in that kind of a role with that kind of expertise, without getting slammed with lawsuits, getting slammed with, complaints to the Department of Labor or whatever. They were lucky, but most firms won't be that lucky. And it can kill you. I mean, you can have a great product or service, but when you start to scale, if you're not keeping track of those types of issues, a single lawsuit or a group of lawsuits or complaints or OSHA violations or whatever, that stuff can kill you and your firm.
Yeah. And a proper HR function has really two benefits. One you just discussed, which is capping your downside risk on the unfortunate thing, like being out of compliance or being sued. But the area that I really like to focus on is what's the upside? So for example, in the software business, they say that a great programmer is worth 100 times more than an average programmer, right? So if you have a strategic HR function that thinks about upside as well as downside, they're starting to bring in much greater talent for your organization. And what does that do to the company overall? That family-run business who's been in business for 100 years, which is no easy feat to be in business that long, they're at 1,000 employees. I wonder if they had an HR function, maybe they'd be at 10,000 employees. I mean, 100 years is a long time, right? So, what was the opportunity cost? What was the missed cost of not investing properly in the people function?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're speaking my language. I completely agree on the upside of good people management practices within organizations. Well, let's take our last few minutes now and talk a little bit more about exiting. So you described the kind of organizational life cycle and the stages that you'll typically go through. And you get to a certain stage, and whether it's thinking about leaving to start another firm or retiring or whatever your goal is, there comes a time where you want to start exiting. How do you decide when that time is? When is the timing right for you? And how do you start doing that effectively so that you don't completely disrupt and dismantle all of the stuff that you've been working so hard on?
Yeah. So the first thing to focus on is to make sure you have an asset someone's willing to buy. Everybody talks about exiting, but the overwhelming majority of people can't exit. And they can't exit because what they've built has no value. It has value to them. But if someone's going to buy your business, they're buying an asset, and that asset needs to be valued somehow. And if the asset is just you or a group of you, they don't need to buy you. They can hire you or the equivalent of you. So that's the very first thing, is to make sure that what you've built, somebody wants to buy. And that's a big subject. And given our time today, that could be a conversation for an entirely separate episode. But let's say, for example, that you do have something, you have, a great growth business with repeat and recurring revenue and great gross margins and net margins and uh, patented intellectual property or um, intellectual capital that could be leveraged in new and exciting ways. So let's say you've done all that, which is a big if. Now the question comes down to people. Okay, so if you're selling your firm, the person who's buying you is thinking about the future, not the past. And this is a common mistake. Founders say, "Here's everything I built. Pay me X for it." Well, the people that are buying you don't care what you built. They care about the future. What they're offering you is the present value of future cash flows. So let's say you're making $1 million a year right now. They want to know that you can make 2 million, or 3 million, or 4 million, or 5 million, and they're going to pay you based on their assumptions as to what that's going to be in the future. So, in terms of figuring out when to exit, which is what your question is, sometimes it's out of your control. You want to create that option for yourself by building something that can be sold. That's the first thing. And now you even have that option to explore. And then secondly, if you do have that option, you've got to think about who might want to buy you, for what price and on what terms. And that takes you to the fundamental question. And maybe this is the one thing that your listeners should take away from today's call. And that is distinguishing between what the business is worth and what the business is worth to you. And those are two different things. As an entrepreneur, you got a lot of emotional energy wrapped up in your business, and your business is worth something to you. Maybe it's part of your personal identity. Maybe it's part of your personal fulfillment. Maybe it's part of some purpose or cause you're passionate about, and that has worth to you. But the firm that's buying you probably isn't placing a dollar amount on that. They're a little bit more cold, and they're placing a value on it based on the assets and the potential cash flow of it. So if somebody's willing to pay you more for your business than what it's worth to you, sell it. If somebody's willing to pay you less than it's worth to you, then don't sell it.
Yeah, great advice. And of course, this is a very personal thing. Assuming, like you said, it's a big assumption, but assuming we have something that's worth buying that other people are interested in, making the decision on when and how to exit is a very personal decision. There's so many factors that would go into that: family dynamics, professional dynamics, the market, all sorts of things, and what types of offers you're getting. But I like your point about just give yourself the option, give yourself the opportunity by having something that's seen as valuable to others, not just yourself. I'm passionate about my work. I'm passionate about the stuff that I do in my firm. Dispassionately though, let's look at it. Let's see what value is actually there. How would other people value it? And if I can make sure that there's value for other people, then I have the option. And if I choose to sell and I can start looking around and looking at options, great. And but it's wonderful to have that opportunity, to have the option.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, very good. Well, Greg, it has been a real pleasure talking with you today. Many really great insights and good things, food for thought for me personally, and hopefully for the listeners as well. Before we close, I wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your organization, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Sure. 3 ways to get connected. So first, go to collective54.com. If you're interested in joining that membership organization, that's one. Number 2, on that same website, collective54.com, you can subscribe to our podcast, which if you're listening to this, then you might be interested in podcast. Or you can go to amazon.com and buy my book. It's called The Boutique: How to Start, Scale, and Sell a Professional Services Firm.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Greg. It has been a pleasure. I encourage listeners to reach out, to get connected, to find out more about what Greg and his organization can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. We are excited about the launch of HCI's new magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine designed to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We will be publishing issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. Check out the first issue and let us know what you think. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.